had been dying for 6 weeks when I first touched his hand. I was not supposed to touch him at all. That was made plain to me on the morning I arrived at the Velhari Imperial Palace. Made plain by Physician Prefect Sovan Ardith, delivered the orientation lecture in the tone of a man who has given it so many times, he no longer hears his own words. The human auxiliary staff were there to maintain the sickbay environs, to sterilize the instrument trays, to log the environmental readings, and to ensure the attending physicians found the ward in correct order when they arrived. We were not there to diagnose. We were not there to assess. And we were, under no circumstances, to initiate contact with a patient of royal blood without a supervising physician present and documented in the intake log. He said patient of royal blood and looked directly at me. I was the only human in the room. I nodded, because there was nothing useful to say. I had been a nurse for 22 years. I had worked 2 field postings in a trauma bay on the Vareth corridor before the lottery placed me here. I knew when I was being told to stay small, and I had learned over 22 years that arguing the point at the first briefing was the fastest way to ensure nobody listened to you at any later briefing when it actually mattered. So I nodded. I went to my quarters. I unpacked my kit. The spare thermostat cuffs, the portable reader, 2 dog-eared instruction cards I'd carried since my second posting, because I was the sort of person who dog-ears instruction cards. And I ported to the sickbay the next morning, at 5th bell, which was an hour before the Velhari physicians typically arrived. And I set about learning everything the room could tell me, before anyone senior got there to stop me from looking. Prince's room was the second chamber off the main ward, separated by a panel of translucent aqua glass that diffused the light from the corridor into something soft. His name was Soveth. He was 7 years old, which was approximately 11 by human reckoning, though the Velhari maturation curve made direct comparison inexact. He was small even for Velhari, with pale silver-gray skin his people carried, and the faint luminescent tracery along his collarbone that meant, I had learned from the orientation packet, that he was of direct royal descent. When I first looked through that aqua glass panel, he was on his back in the adjustable bed, and he was very still, and he was the color of something that had been washed too many times. The bed's own ambient sensor was reading his temperature as subnormal, not by a catastrophic margin, but by a steady, persistent one. The kind of subnormal that doesn't spike, doesn't threaten immediate crisis, just sits there for like a stone on a chest and wears you down. His breathing was shallow. He was connected to a nutrient line because he hadn't been eating. The environmental suite that governed the room's atmospheric mix, pressure, and warmth was logged at Velhari standard parameters. The orientation packet said was correct for a Velhari patient. I looked at those parameters for a long time. Then I looked at the prince. Then I went to find the environmental log for the past 6 weeks to see if those parameters had ever been adjusted, and whether anyone had noted a correlation between the adjustments and the boy's response. The log was thorough. The parameters had not been adjusted once in 6 weeks. They had been set on the day of admission and left exactly where they were, because the parameters were, by every standard reference in the Velhari Imperial Medical Registry, correct for a Velhari patient. Wrote that down in my personal log, which I kept in my own notation system, and which no one was going to read. I wrote, parameters correct per registry, never adjusted, no correlation study. Then I went and cleaned the instrument trays, because that was my job. And I did it so well and quietly that when Physician Prefect Ardith arrived at 6th bell with his 3 senior associates, none of them looked in my direction at all. That was fine. That was in fact exactly what I needed. The Velhari medical hierarchy was not unkind. I want to be precise about that, because it would be easy, in the telling, to make them the villains of it. The cold empire's cold physicians, who saw the invisible human nurse as a nuisance, and missed what she saw, because they were too proud to look. It wasn't quite like that. Physician Prefect Ardith was a serious man who had trained for 30 years, and who had in that time treated 6 members of the royal family, and published 2 volumes of clinical findings that I found, when I looked them up, to be genuinely careful and genuinely cited work. He was not incapable. He was not indifferent. He was working from the assumption that the problem was physiological. A system-level failure in the prince's immune regulation, likely genetic in origin, probably progressive. And so every intervention he designed was a physiological intervention. Compounds, nutrient adjustments, atmospheric fine-tuning, within a range he considered medically sound. Every 10 days a new specialist arrived from a different corner of the empire. A Velhari hematologist from the northern provinces, an endocrinological consultant from the Tharvan Medical Institute, a specialist in pediatric neurology whose name I couldn't pronounce. They conferred in the corridor. They adjusted the compounds. They logged their findings with meticulous care. The prince continued to fade. I was not invited to the case conferences. I was not asked my observations. I cleaned the instrument trays. I logged the environmental readings. I restocked the supply cabinet, and I watched. What I watched was this. The prince was worse when they came in. Not dramatically. Not in the way that would have shown up clearly in a logged vital. Not a spike in distress markers, not a visible agitation. Just a pattern. A subtle, consistent, 6-week pattern that I could see because I was there before the physicians arrived and I was there after they left. And what I noticed was that his resting temperature, already subnormal, dropped a further fraction of a degree in the hour following each consultation and took 3 to 4 hours to recover even to its baseline. It had not recovered to its admission baseline in 6 weeks. Each drop left him, on average, a fraction lower than before. I wrote that in my log too. On the 12th day of my posting, I filed a formal observation notice through the auxiliary staff reporting channel. This was the correct procedure. I had checked the auxiliary staff handbook 3 times to be sure. The notice went to the physician prefect's administrative clerk, who was a Velhari man named Doss, who wore immaculate gray robes and who had been managing the palace medical administration for what appeared to be several decades. Doss received the notice, logged it as received, told me that the physician prefect would review auxiliary observations at his discretion. I said thank you and went back to the ward. 15th day, I filed a second notice. This one included the correlation data I had assembled. 2 weeks of environmental logs referenced against the vital sign readings in the times I had personally logged, which were more granular than the physician-recorded entries, because I was there more often. I had kept the language technical and neutral, because I had been around enough senior medical staff to know that tone was everything. Doss received the second notice, logged it as received, and told me the physician prefect was occupied with the specialist consultation from the Tharvan Institute. I said thank you. I went back to the ward. On the 17th day, one of the junior physicians, a young Velhari man named Esavar, who was 2 years out of his training and who had the look, someone who had not been sleeping, stopped me in the corridor and said quietly that he had read my observation notices. He had read them because Doss had given them to him to file away, and he had been curious. And he was now asking me, in a tone that suggested he was doing so, against his better professional judgment, what exactly I thought I was seeing. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the aqua glass panel and the small, still shape visible through it. Then he said, "I'll mention it at the next conference." "I appreciate that," I said. "I don't know if it will go anywhere," he said. "I know," I said. It didn't go anywhere. I found out from Esavar 2 days later, in the same corridor, physician prefect Ardith had acknowledged the observation and noted that the environmental parameters were set per registry standard for Velhari patients, that any deviation from registry standard required formal authorization from the Imperial Medical Registry itself, and that unauthorized environmental adjustments in a royal sickbay were both clinically inadvisable and procedurally impermissible. I thanked Esavar for telling me. That night I looked up the authorization procedure for an emergency deviation from registry environmental standard. It required the signature of the attending physician prefect, the counter-signature of one specialist of equivalent rank, and a written clinical justification filed with the Imperial Registry's Northern Office for review within 48 hours of the deviation's implementation. The review timeline for non-emergency deviations was 14 to 21 days. The prince had been declining for 6 weeks. He did not have 14 to 21 days to wait for a review. I wrote that in my log. Then I put the log down and sat in the quiet of my quarters for a while, and thought about what I was going to do. I am not someone who breaks rules casually. I want to be honest about that. 2 years in field nursing had given me a clear picture of what happened when auxiliary staff began acting on their own assessments without authorization. Not always bad outcomes, sometimes necessary ones, but always complicated, and always costly in ways that ran past the immediate case. I had a posting here that paid well enough to send half home every month. I had, if I kept my head down and my notices properly filed, a reasonable chance of a second posting in an environment that was, for all its stiffness, clean and safe and far removed from the Verith corridor. What I also had was 17 days of watching a 7-year-old boy get smaller. I thought about the temperature data. I thought about the way his breathing always steadied in the single hour between 4th and 5th bell in the morning, when the palace was quiet and nobody medical came in. I thought about the pattern I had been logging for 2 weeks, and about the simple and obvious thing it suggested, which was not a complicated physiological intervention, not a specialist compound, not a deviation from registry standard, requiring 14 days of review. It was the simplest thing I could think of, and it was the thing that no physician in the building had thought to try, not because they were careless, but because it was not in the registry. I also thought about the morning readings from the past 8 days. I had them memorized. They moved in one direction, up, slowly, incrementally, the kind of line that would not show up as dramatic on a chart. But that was plainly and undeniably different from the line that had been falling for the 6 weeks before I arrived. I had not imagined it. The data had not imagined it. The data was the same kind of data that physician prefect Ardith used to build his prognosis and compound protocols, just logged by a different hand at a different hour. And it said what it said. It was not in the registry, because it was not a Valari thing. It was a human thing, and there was, in that entire palace, one human. I went to the sick bay at 4:30 bell. The night watch orderly was a Velhari man named This, who was young enough that he had not yet developed the senior staff talent for looking through people. He looked at me when I came in, and I could see the calibration happening behind his eyes. I was auxiliary staff. I was human. I was here without a supervising physician. None of this was standard. My log shows an anomalous reading from the environmental suite, I said. This was technically true. I had flagged the reading myself in my own log, which was not the official log, but I did not specify this. I'm here to verify it against the manual calibration. This was plausible enough that This gave me a small nod and returned to his station at the ward entrance. I went to the second chamber. I sat down in the chair at the prince's bedside, the chair that was always there, that the physicians sat in during their consultations. That was made of the pale Velhari hardwood that felt warm even when the room was cool. I looked at Sovith for a while. He was worse than he'd been 2 weeks ago. I didn't need the temperature reader to tell me that, though I pressed it lightly to the back of his hand anyway, out of habit, and noted what it told me. His breathing was the shallow, careful kind that the body uses when it has decided to conserve everything. The luminescent tracery on his collarbone, which I had looked up and which meant royal lineage, was dim. On his admission, I had heard one of the physicians mention that it was usually distinctly visible. I had not seen it bright since I arrived, the temperature reader back in my pocket. I pulled my chair a little closer to the bed. Then I put my palm flat on his sternum. He was cold, colder than the room, colder than a living body should be, colder in the way that told me his thermoregulatory function was failing to compensate for something, and that the registry standard environmental suite wasn't compensating for it either. And that what this boy needed was contact warmth, which was the kind that the body recognized as safe, the kind that triggered the parasympathetic response in mammals. And I had been betting for 17 days in whatever evolutionary branching had produced the Velhari, alongside their pale silver skin and their royal, luminescent tracery and their 30-year trained physicians, who had never thought to simply put a warm hand on his chest. He stirred slightly under my palm, just a small shift, not waking, not conscious, but a movement toward warmth the way a plant turns toward light. I started to hum. Not a Velhari melody, I didn't know any. I knew 3 songs my mother had sung when I was small and sick, and I knew them in the way you know things that were laid down before memory. Not as information, but as something older, something in the chest and the throat. The kind of knowing that doesn't require effort. My mother had a low voice and she sang slightly like Kia, and she had never in her life known that she was singing to me, something that would one day sit in the chest of a woman in her mid-40s on a planet that neither of us had ever heard of when I was 6 years old and burning with fever. I hummed the first one song low, and even my palm steady on the boy's sternum. About 40 minutes in, his temperature came up by 0.2 of a degree. It is the smallest number I have ever been proud of. I sat there until second bell past fifth. I hummed all 3 songs twice, the third one 3 times because it was the shortest, and it seemed to suit his breathing. Around the time I started the second pass of the third song, he turned his head toward me, still asleep, still far under, just turned it toward the sound the way you'd turn your face to something warm and familiar. I kept my palm where it was, and I kept humming, and I watched his sternum rise and fall, and the rise was deeper than it had been when I arrived. And the fall was slower, which meant he was relaxing, which meant some part of his nervous system had registered what was happening and had decided was safe. At 10 minutes past fifth bell, I heard a sound from the corridor, and I stood up, moved the chair back to its original position, smoothed my tunic, and went to check the manual calibration on the environmental suite, as I had told This I would. The readings I logged were accurate to within tolerance. I logged them, initialed the entry, and went back to my quarters to sleep for 3 hours before my shift. The prince's morning reading showed his temperature was up by 0.4 of a point from the overnight low. Savar logged it with a small frown, checked the compounds the prefect had ordered, wrote possible compound response, continue monitoring in the clinical record. I didn't say anything. The next night I came back. I told This there was a follow-up on the calibration discrepancy from the previous night. He gave me the same small nod. He was a kind young man, and I thought about the fact that I was using his trust in a way that was not quite honest, and I noted that discomfort, and I went into the second chamber anyway. 0.4 that first night, 0.3 the second, 0.6 the third. Small numbers. Slow numbers. The kind of numbers that looked like noise in a data set if you were only checking it from a specialist consult every 10 days. But I was checking it every morning, and I was writing it down, and by the end of the first week of nights, there was a line in my personal log that was clearly and undeniably trending upward. On the 5th night, I brought a thin blanket from the supply cabinet. Not a medical blanket, just one of the lightweight thermal liners from the shelf marked family comfort items, because the Velhari did apparently have some concept of this, even if they didn't appear to be using it much in this case. I folded it once and draped it across the prince's upper body before I sat down. He moved toward it immediately, still sleeping, just his body making a decision his physicians hadn't thought to help it make. On the 6th night, Savar was in the corridor when I arrived. He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been assembling a picture in his mind and has just realized what it is. Then he said, very quietly, "The calibration discrepancy." "Yes," I said. "There isn't one, is there?" I looked at him. He was 26, 27 at the most. He had been logging those morning readings. He knew what the trend looked like. "No," I said. He was quiet for a long moment. He glanced toward the second chamber, toward the aqua glass panel, toward the small form visible through it. "The prefect cannot know I knew," he said. "I understand," I said. He stepped aside. I went in. On the 7th night, something shifted in the room that I couldn't log and didn't try to. I came in as I always did, sat down, put my palm in place, began the first song, and, about 20 minutes in the ambient sensor gave a small reading. I had to check twice, because I'd never seen it that high from him, 37.0 flat, exactly at the lower edge of the clinical threshold, sustained. Not spiking and dropping, but simply sitting there the way a body sits in warmth it has finally decided to keep. I watched it hold for 11 minutes before I let myself believe it was real. The sensor had been accurate before. It was accurate now. He was holding it himself without the contact, which meant something in the process was beginning to take root past the stimulus. The body learning to remember where warmth lived and finding its way back there on its own. I wrote that in my log when I got back to my quarters. I sat on my bunk for a while looking at the number. On the 8th night, the prince opened his eyes. Not fully, not to waking, just enough. A thin silver gleam under his lids, the faint bioluminescence that the Velhari carried in their irises visible for a second, and then his eyes closed again, and he let out a breath that was so much steadier than anything I had heard from him in 3 weeks that I had to sit quietly for a moment with my hand on my own knee and remind myself to keep my face even. I hummed the third song again. He made a sound. Words. Nothing like words, just a small sound, low and without distress, the kind of sound that means I hear you and it's all right. Then he was deeply asleep again, and his temperature was the highest it had been since his admission. I sat with him until fifth bell, and then I went back to my quarters and I wrote in my log. Day 8, temp at departure 37, time above clinical threshold since week 1. Eyes opened at 0312, vocalization, assessment, he is coming back. Then I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I breathed for a while, because I had been holding it more tightly than I realized. The next morning, Physician Prefect Ardeth called me to his office. It was a large room off the main corridor, the kind of room that communicated authority without any single piece of furniture doing the work, just the accumulation of calm, ordered space, the view through the tall windows of the palace's inner courtyard, where the silver-leaved trees stood. Ardeth was behind his desk. Essivar was not present. Doss was present, standing to one side with his hands folded in front of him. Eth looked at me for a moment before he spoke. He was not a warm man, but he was not a cruel one. And what I saw in his face was not anger, exactly. It was something more careful than anger. You have been entering the prince's chamber outside authorized hours, he said. Yes, I said. He waited. As though expecting more, I didn't offer more. You understand, he said. This is a serious breach of the auxiliary staff protocol for a royal patient. I understand that is a breach of the protocol, I said. I filed observation notices on the 12th and 15th days of my posting that I believe are relevant to the patient's condition. Those notices were not acted upon. The prince's vital trend over the past 8 nights suggests the approach I have been using is producing a measurable clinical response. I put my personal log on his desk. I had printed the relevant pages that morning. Ardeth looked at the pages for a long time without touching them. Then he looked up at me. You are an auxiliary nurse, he said. Human. Training covers pediatric thermoregulatory care, parasympathetic response induction, contact warming protocols for patients with compromised autonomous regulation, I said. I have been practicing for 22 years. I am aware this is not standard Velhari clinical practice. I am also aware that standard Velhari clinical practice has not reversed this patient's decline in 6 weeks. The silence in the room was the specific kind of silence that a very senior person produces when they are working out whether they are angry or whether they are, on some level, they are not going to acknowledge in front of a subordinate, simply wrong. You will not enter that chamber again without authorization, Ardeth said. I am reassigning you to the supply inventory duties in the North Wing effective tomorrow morning. Your breach will be noted in your record, said. I picked up my log. I left his office. I walked down the main corridor and past the aquaglass panel, and I looked in at Soveth for 3 seconds. The way you look at a thing, you're not yet willing to leave but can see slipping from your reach. His color was better than it had been 10 days ago. The readings logged that morning had him at 37-1. Still not where I wanted, but holding, and an hour from a full clinical threshold. Then I walked to the North Wing supply inventory, and I started counting bandage rolls, because that was what Ardeth had told me to do, and I was not, despite everything, someone who simply stopped following orders in the moment they cost her something. I did the inventory until 3rd bell. Then I went to my quarters, ate what was in my kit, and sat on my bunk with my log and looked at the temperature data for a long time. I could feel the line wanting to drop. The last 8 nights had built something, built it slowly. In increments that individually looked like nothing, the cumulative direction was unmistakable. Without the nightly contact, without the warmth, without the voice. I had no hard data on how quickly it would reverse, but I had a strong sense, built on 22 years of watching bodies lose and find their equilibrium, that it would reverse faster than it had climbed. The body had not yet internalized whatever the process was well enough to sustain it independently. He was 7 years old. He had been failing for 6 weeks. He had an empire's worth of physicians recording his failure, and a king, somewhere in this palace, who had, presumably been told in the careful, abstracted language of medical prognosis, that his son was unlikely to improve. I put my log away. I washed my face. At 4:30 bell, I put on my tunic and I went to the sick bay. This was not on the night watch. The orderly at the entrance was a Velhari woman I didn't recognize, older, keen, with the manner of someone who had been working palace shifts for a long time. She looked at me with the flat assessment that experience produces. Auxiliary staff, she said. It was not quite a question. I have a patient priority note, I said, which was a lie, and which I said clearly and steadily because there are moments in 22 years of nursing when you have exhausted every proper channel, and the only thing between the patient and the outcome is the quality of your nerve. She looked at me for several seconds. Then she looked past me toward the aqua glass panel. Then she stepped aside without a word. I have thought about that woman since. Don't know her name. I don't know what she saw or decided, or why she made the choice she made. I only know that she stood aside and I was grateful for it in a way I still can't properly articulate. I went into the second chamber. His temperature reading was 36.6. It had dropped 4/10 in less than 18 hours. I had been right about the reversal rate. I sat down. I put my palm on his sternum. He was cold in the way a small frightened animal is cold. Not just temperature, but a pulling inward, a conservation of everything, the body hoarding what little it had because it had been alone, long enough to stop expecting replenishment from outside. Self. I started to hum. All 3 songs, in order, low and even, the sound filling the small room without amplifying, just existing there, the way sounds exist in a quiet place. Partway through the first song, I became aware of a stillness outside the aqua glass panel. Not the orderly. The orderly had returned to her station at the ward entrance. This was a different stillness, the particular quality of a space that has been occupied by something large and quiet, and has not yet let you know it's there. I kept my palm where it was. I kept humming. I didn't turn around. After the first song, I heard a sound from the corridor. Not a footstep. More the sound of someone shifting their weight. Then nothing again. I went through the second song. Prince's temperature was climbing back. Slowly, 1/10 of a degree at a time, but climbing. His breathing had deepened already, the way it always did within the first hour. Whatever pathway I had been building in him over 8 nights was still there, still accessible, and it responded to the same stimulus it had built itself around. Halfway through the third song, his eyes opened. Fully this time. Both of them. All the way, the silver-gray irises of the Velhari with the bioluminescent ring of pale gold that royal children carried. And he was looking at the ceiling for a moment, and then he turned his head, and he looked at me. I stopped humming. He looked at me for a long time. He had the wide, unguarded look of a child who has been very far away and is trying to make sense of where he has come back to. I had seen that look before. It takes a few seconds for the world to assemble itself around a person who has been very ill and has just, in some important way, returned. Then he said something in Velhari, 2 or 3 syllables, the tone low and without distress. I didn't speak Velhari well enough to follow, but I had learned the word for again in the first week, because it was common in the medical log entries, and what he said sounded enough like it that I thought I understood him. Again? I said. He looked at me steadily, then very carefully, the way children speak to adults, who they are not sure can understand them, he said. The song, again. His voice was the voice of a child who hadn't used it in 6 weeks. Thin and careful and very real. I put my palm back on his sternum. I started the third song again from the beginning. Behind me from the corridor, I heard the quietest possible intake of breath. I had an audience of one. I did not look at who it was. I sang the song all the way through, and then, because he was watching me with those wide gold-ringed eyes, and his temperature was 37. One in the reading on the ambient sensor was the best it had been since week 1, and he had not yet looked away. I sang the first song again too, the one my mother had used when the fever was at its worst. The slow, steady one, that doesn't have any particular melody so much as a particular feeling, like a hand on the forehead in the dark, telling you that something larger than the fever is keeping watch. When I finished, Soveth's eyes were closed again. But his breathing was deep and regular, and his temperature was 37.3, and the color of his skin in the sickbay's soft light was not the washed-out gray of the past 6 weeks. There was something in it. Something returning. I sat with him for a few more minutes. Then I stood, moved the chair back, smoothed my tunic, and turned to leave. King Atharvan of the Velari was standing in the corridor. I had seen him twice before, both times at a significant distance. Once in the formal progression down the palace's main hall, once at the edge of the east courtyard while I was carrying supply inventory between buildings. He was tall, as the Velhari tended toward, with the same silver-gray coloring as his son but darker, edged with the deep charcoal that the Velhari males developed in the second decade of life. The royal luminescent tracery on his collarbone was, at this distance, unmistakably bright. He wore no formal robes. He was in the plain gray of someone who had been awake all night and had not thought about what he was wearing. He was looking at me the way people look at something they did not expect to see and are still processing. I stopped. I stood where I was. I had left my palm reader in my pocket, and my log in my quarters, and my tunic was plain auxiliary staff gray without any insignia that would have meant anything to a king, and I was acutely aware, in the way that only becomes very clear after the fact, that I had just been caught in that room without authorization for the second night in a row, after being explicitly reassigned. The king did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, in Velhari, something that I didn't fully catch. I had enough of the language for context, but not for precision, and I said quietly, "My Velhari is limited. I understand roughly half of what you said." Something shifted on his face. Not quite surprise. Something past surprise. Something that lands after surprise has already spent itself. "How long," he said, carefully measured trade speech, "have you been doing this?" 9 nights, I said, including tonight. 9 nights. Yes. He looked past me into the second chamber. Soveth was deeply asleep, the thermal liner folded across his chest, his temperature at 37.3. The ambient sensor's readout was the best I had seen in 3 weeks. He spoke, the king said. It was not quite a question. He asked me to sing the song again, I said. The king was very still. He was looking at his son through the aqua glass panel with the expression of, a man who has been told something is irretrievable and has just found it in his hand. There is a particular quality to that moment. I have seen it in parents before, in the corridor outside trauma bays and in the careful hush of recovery wards, and it always has the same texture, is the texture of something very large and very tightly held coming slightly loose, just enough to show you what's inside. He stood there for a while. I didn't speak. There was nothing useful to say, and I had learned, over 22 years, that the moments that need the most silence are the ones where someone else's world is quietly reassembling itself. Then the king turned from the window. You filed observation notices, he said, too. On the 12th and 15th days of my posting. I was not informed of this. No, sir. He looked at me for a moment. I could see him placing the pieces together. The notices, the reassignment, the 9 nights, the temperature climbing in the record. He had almost certainly been reading every morning for 6 weeks with the dread of a man, watching a line he cannot stop. The physician prefect reassigned you, he said. Yesterday morning. I was told I had violated the auxiliary staff protocol. I was reassigned to supply inventory in the north wing, and yet you are here. Yes, I said. He was quiet, then he said, why? It was a reasonable question. I thought about how to answer it and decided, as I usually did with reasonable questions, that the simplest answer was the right one. Because your son was cold, I said, and I knew how to warm him, and there was no one else in the building who did. The king looked at me for a long time after that, not with the assessment of a man who doubts what he is hearing, with the expression of a man who is hearing something true and is working out what truth of this particular kind costs. You will return to the sickbay, he said. On full authorization, I will speak to the physician prefect. I appreciate that. He paused. Your name, Marin Voss. He repeated it, carefully, the way someone memorizes a thing they intend to hold on to. Then he looked once more through the aqua glass panel. The prince's chest rose and fell in the long, even rhythm of a child sleeping without effort. Nurse Voss, the king said. Tomorrow evening I will receive you formally. I understand. He didn't say anything else after that. He walked back down the corridor, and I watched him go. the back of him upright and measured in the plain gray, his hands not quite steady at his sides. And then I went back to my quarters to sleep. The formal reception 3 days later was in the smaller of the 2 staterooms. The protocol officer had described to me in a briefing as informal by palace standards, which apparently meant 200 people, full court assembly, and a tier of officials in ranked order along the far wall with their collars buttoned to the top. Physician Prefect Ardith was there. He stood with the other court physicians in the medical tier, his expression the controlled blank of a man who is bearing something he has decided to bear without visible difficulty. Esivar was not in the medical tier. He was at the back of the room, near the entrance, the plain robes of a physician not yet senior enough for a formal position. When I arrived and was directed to my place at the front, he caught my eye for a moment. I gave him a small nod. King Tharvan stood at the chamber's center, and beside him, in a carved chair that had been brought out and set to his immediate right, sat Soveth. He was not yet at full strength. His light formal robes, the pale blue of the royal house, embroidered with the luminescent thread that matched the tracery on his collarbone, which was bright now, properly bright, the gold ring bioluminescence visible even from several meters away. He looked small in the chair. He was upright. His eyes were open and clear, moving across the room with the curiosity of a child who has been indoors for a long time and is finding the world vivid again. When I came to stand before the king, Soveth looked at me immediately. The way he looked was not the way the court was looking. Not the formal assessment. Not the calculation of significance. Not the slight discomfort of a hierarchy trying to work out how to categorize a thing outside its categories. He just looked at me the way a child looks at someone they recognize. With a directness that doesn't know how to be anything other than what it is. The king spoke the formal address in Velhari, and the protocol officer translated in murmurs beside me, and it amounted to, in the name of the house and by royal authority, recognition for an act of singular care and competence in service to the crown. There was more than that. The formal phrasing ran for several minutes, but that was the substance of it. Then the king said, also formally, and in trade speech, so the room could follow if they spoke it. Nurse Voss, the House of Tharvan wishes to honor this service appropriately, offer you a place at court, with the standing of a house physician of the first order, and the materials of that office, the salary, chambers in the palace's eastern wing, and the formal court designation. The room was very quiet. I stood in that quiet for a moment and let the offer be real, which it was, and let it be significant, which it also was. A place at court. A salary that would have made the posting salary look like an apprentice's stipend. Chambers in the eastern wing. I had walked past the eastern wing once, and the corridor alone had been more gracious than anything I had lived in. I looked at the king, then I looked at Soveth, who was watching me with those clear, patient eyes. Sir, I said, I am grateful. I mean that without qualification. I paused. I would ask, instead of the court appointment, if I might keep my posting at the infirmary, the position I came here for. I hesitated, then added, there are likely other patients who could use someone checking the calibration. Someone in the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh. More the involuntary escape of something, almost a laugh, suppressed very quickly. I did not look to see who. The king studied me for a moment. His expression was the expression of a man who has just been surprised, not unpleasantly. Posting, he said. Nothing more. The posting, I said. And if it isn't an imposition, a word in the protocol for auxiliary observations. So the next time someone files his notice, it doesn't sit in a clerk's inbox for 17 days. The silence stretched a beat longer. Then the king said, that can be arranged. He looked at me with something that I would describe as respect, except that the word feels too small for what it contained. It was the respect of a very large and powerful person who has just seen something they did not expect and have decided to look at squarely instead of away. And that is a different thing from the ordinary respect of rank or title. It is the harder kind. The posting is confirmed, he said, and the protocol amendment, effective immediately. I gave him the acknowledgement that the protocol officer had coached me through. A shallow forward inclination, hands low. Then I stepped back to let the next formal business proceed. As I moved to take my place to the side of the room, I passed the chair where Soveth sat. He had been watching the whole exchange with the focused attention of a child who is understanding more than adults typically give him credit for. He said something in Velhari as I passed. Low, directed at me, not at the room. I had enough of the language by then to catch it. He said, "You'll still come." I looked at him. He was not asking if I would still treat him. He knew the answer to that, from the clinical side, from the post-recovery visits that had already been agreed. He was asking something slightly different. Whether I would still sit beside him, whether the warm hand and the low songs were a thing that belonged to the sick room and the crisis, or a thing that could survive into the ordinary evenings of a boy who was no longer dying. Yes, I said, I'll still come. He gave me a very small nod, with the gravity of someone older, and then he turned his face back toward the room. I found my place at the wall and stood through the rest of the ceremony, and when it was over, I walked back through the palace corridors to the infirmary, and I checked the supply cabinet and the instrument trays and logged the morning's environmental readings the way I did every morning. Then I sat in the small office at the back of the ward that had been, until a formal message arrived from the palace administrative wing that afternoon, technically not mine, and I opened personal log to write the day's notes. I sat for a while without writing anything. Outside the infirmary window, the inner courtyard was coming into the early afternoon light, and the silver-leaved trees were doing what they always did, which was catch the light and give it back changed, slower, colder, cleaner. I had been looking at those trees from this window since my first morning here, and I had not once until this moment stopped to find them beautiful, because I had been busy, because there was always something to log, always a tray to clean, always a reading to run twice because the first time you never entirely trust. I wrote the date. I wrote, Soveth's temperature logged at 37.6 this morning, first reading above full threshold since admission, recovery projection, 2 to 3 weeks to full baseline, pending. Then I wrote, protocol amendment requested and confirmed. I put my pen down. I looked at the trees for another minute or two. Then Esavar knocked on the open door frame. The young physician with the careful eyes who had stepped aside in the corridor nights ago, and not said anything, which was its own kind of bravery in a medical hierarchy. The prefect, he said, and then stopped and reconsidered his phrasing. Physician Prefect Ardeth has asked if he might review your observation methodology, the correlation analysis. A pause. Officially, I looked at him. He didn't enjoy asking, Esavar added. I imagine not, I said. I closed my log and put it in the desk drawer and stood up. Tell him I'm available after 5th bell, I said. And tell him to bring his case notes from week 2 onward. If we're going to do this properly, I want to see where the data diverged from my read, and what drove that. It'll be more useful than just hearing about my method. Estevar looked at me for a moment, with the expression I had first noticed in the corridor, the assembling of a picture expression. Then he said, I'll tell him. He left. I heard his footsteps going down the corridor toward the physician's wing. I picked up my supply manifest from the desk and went back out into the ward. Because the cabinet near the east window was still 3 items short from the morning restock, and nobody was going to count those bandage rolls but me, the prince continued to improve. By the end of the following week, he was taking meals in the sick bay sitting up, small meals, carefully paced, but taking them himself, which he had not done in 2 months. The luminescent tracery on his collarbone was consistently bright. The ambient temperature in his room was running 1.5 degrees warmer than the registry standard for a Velhari patient, cause I had filed the formal deviation request on the day after the ceremony with Ardeth's counter-signature, which he provided without comment, and which I logged carefully and sent to the Imperial Registry for its 14-day review. I came to sit with him every 3rd evening, as I had promised. We did not always talk much. He was still recovering. And there were evenings where he simply listened while I hummed. And evenings where he wanted to tell me about things with the serious, considered detail of a child who has been lying still for too long and has a great deal of stored observation to unload. He told me about the courtyard trees, which he could see from his window, and which he had been watching for the weeks he had been confined to the sick bay. He told me that the largest one, the one in the northeast corner, was older than the palace itself. He told me That in the Velari tradition, the silver-leaved trees were planted when a house was established, and the oldest one marked the founding, and his great-great-great-grandfather had put that one in with his own hands. "Do you have trees like that?" he asked me. I thought about it. "Not royal trees," I said. "But my mother had a tree in her yard she planted when I was born. She said she did it so I'd have something growing at the same rate I was." He thought about this for a moment. "Is it taller than you now?" "Much taller," I said. He seemed satisfied by this. Physician Prefect Ardith and I worked through the case notes over 3 sessions. He was not a man who apologized directly. It was not, I thought, in his formation. But he engaged with the correlation data in a way that was its own form of acknowledgement, careful and thorough. And when he presented the findings to the full medical staff 2 weeks later, he cited my observation notices by date and described the contact warming protocol in terms that were precise without being dismissive. He did not cite me as the originating authority in the way I might have if I had been writing it. But he included, in the recommendation appendix, standing procedure for auxiliary staff observations to be reviewed by a junior physician within 48 hours of filing, countersigned by the same. Essever told me about this after the session. He seemed to find it significant. He didn't have to include that, Essevar said. "No," I said, "he didn't." Essevar was quiet for a moment. "Then he's going to use your methodology for the next case." I thought about that. About what it meant that a 30-year Velhari physician was going to look at a protocol that was, at its heart, a middle-aged human nurse putting her palm on a child's chest and humming the songs her mother had left her. About the distance that knowledge had to travel to get from there to here, and what it cost in transit, and whether the cost had been worth it. It had been worth it. I knew that. I had known it 9 for nights, and I knew it more clearly now. In the ordinary light of the infirmary, with the silver-leaved trees in the courtyard window, and the prince down the corridor getting measurably better every morning. "Good," I said. "That's good." I went back to my supply manifest. On the 40th day after the ceremony, a message arrived from the palace administrative wing. It was formal in the way of palace documents, with the household seal at the top and the date in the Velhari calendar notation I had finally learned to read. The body of it was brief. It said, "Protocol amendment has been ratified by the Imperial Medical Registry. Effective immediately, all auxiliary staff observation notices in palace medical facilities are to be reviewed within 48 hours of filing and responded to in writing within 72. The ratification references, in its preamble, the case of the previous 6 weeks and the outcome produced by an observation that was filed and not acted upon in the required time frame." The last line read, "This amendment applies to all facilities under Imperial Medical Registry jurisdiction." I read it twice. Then I folded it in half and put it in the desk drawer with my log, and I sat for a moment, looking at the courtyard trees in the afternoon light. The registry had jurisdictions across 11 systems. In 11 systems worth of palace sick bays and imperial medical facilities, there were probably other auxiliary staff, human and otherwise, filing observation notices and watching them sit in a clerk's inbox for 17 days. There were probably other C patients. There were probably other things that were simple and obvious and embarrassingly unheroic and had not been tried because they were not in the registry. Because they were not the kind of thing that a 30-year trained physician would think to do first. Because they were the kind of thing that only looked obvious after they worked. I was not going to see any of those cases. I was going to stay here, in this ward with my supply manifests, and my instrument trays and my personal log and my 3 sessions a week with a recovering royal child who wanted to know about trees. That was the right size of thing for me. I had never wanted to be large. I had wanted for 22 years to be present, to be the person who showed up at 4th bell and noticed the thing nobody else was close enough to see. That was enough. That had always been enough. I picked up the supply manifest from the corner of the desk and went out into the ward to count the bandage rolls. 3 weeks later, Soveth was discharged from the sick bay. He walked out of the second chamber on his own feet, which sounds like a small thing and was not a small thing. Not after 2 months in that bed, not after 6 weeks of the kind of slow fading. that had left his physicians writing carefully hedged prognosis in the clinical record. His color was right. His temperature was right. The tracery on his collarbone was bright in the way it was supposed to be bright, the way it had probably been bright before all of this. And seeing it that way felt like looking at a word that had finally been spelled correctly. The king came to collect him. He came without the formal retinue, just himself and the prince's personal attendant, which was not, I understood, a thing that kings typically did in the Velhari court. He came to the sickbay entrance, and he was there in the corridor when Soveth walked out. And the thing that happened between them when the prince came through the door was a private thing. But I looked away from the way you look away from some things that belongs entirely to two people and to nobody else. After a moment, the king looked up. He looked at me where I was standing at the ward entrance. He gave me the acknowledgement that the protocol officer had taught me during the pre-ceremony briefing. The shallow forward inclination with the right hand at the low position, which was the one used between equals. I returned it. Then he took his son's hand, and they walked down the corridor, and I listened to their footsteps, until the sound turned the corner and was gone. Morning came through the courtyard windows the way it always did, falling across the ward floor in pale slanted lines. The silver-leaved trees were doing what they always did, catching the light and giving it back changed, slower and cleaner, the way certain things do when they have been in the world, long enough to know what to keep and what to let go. I went back into the ward to begin the day's rounds. There was work to do, and it was mine, and I was glad to be doing it.